This is the easier-to-read version of 1984 by George Orwell, retold and narrated by Sarah Simpson. Part 2, Chapter 9. Winston was so tired his entire body felt numb. The last 6 days had been horrible. He and everyone else in the Ministry of Truth had been working 18 hours a day. They were given 2 3-hour nap breaks in a 24-hour period. They slept on mattresses set up on the floor in the hallway. All of their meals were brought to their workstations by the cafeteria workers so they could keep working while they ate. There had been a major change in the war, and it was their job to change all of Oceania's documents as quickly as possible. It all started at the end of Hate Week. Hate Week had been just as angry and violent as usual. There were marches, screaming, angry songs about killing the enemy, and lots of speakers telling everyone how evil Eurasia was, since they were at war. By the final day of Hate Week, the people of Oceania were so angry at Eurasia that they would have gladly torn Eurasian soldiers to pieces with their bare hands. On the last day of Hate Week, one of the members of the inner party was giving a speech about the evil actions of Eurasia. He was screaming and waving his arms around. A crowd of several thousand people was listening, and all of them were screaming with anger too. There were 1,000 children there, all of them dressed in their spies' uniforms. They were the worst. They listened to every word the man said and were the most hateful people in the crowd. The people didn't even sound human. They sounded like growling animals. In the middle of the speech, a man came onto the stage and handed the speaker a small scrap of paper with something written on it. The speaker looked at the paper and continued yelling. He didn't even hesitate for a second. The only thing that changed was that he was now saying that Oceania was at war with East Asia. Everything else about his speech stayed exactly the same. They were the enemy. They were monsters. They would destroy Oceania. The only difference was that he was saying East Asia now instead of Eurasia. It took several minutes for the crowd to even notice the change, but when they did, they went crazy. When they realized that the posters hanging up all around them were wrong, after all, they said that Eurasia, not East Asia, was the enemy, they started tearing down the posters and lighting them on fire. Instead of questioning the speaker and calling him out on his lie, they started screaming that the Brotherhood had put up fake posters to confuse them. Obviously, it was Goldstein and the Brotherhood. They wanted the people of Oceania to attack their allies, so the whole country would be destroyed. It was the only possible reason. In the middle of this chaos, someone tapped Winston on the shoulder and said, "I think you dropped your briefcase." Just like that, Winston had a bag in his hand with a copy of Goldstein's forbidden book inside. He knew not to look at it there. He would have to wait until he was safe in the room above Mr. Charrington's shop, but he had no idea when he'd be able to go there again. With the huge change to the enemy of the war, Winston and the rest of the Ministry of Truth would have a lot of records to change. He knew that everyone would have to report to work immediately, so he walked to the Ministry of Truth and sat down at his workstation. The next 6 days were horrible. So much had to be changed, revised, and destroyed. Every article that said Eurasia was Oceania's ally had to be changed to say that Eurasia was the enemy. Every article that said East Asia was Oceania's enemy had to be changed to say that East Asia was Oceania's ally. It was complicated, detailed, and exhausting work. The entire time, Winston kept the briefcase with him. He even slept with it under his head like a pillow. When the work was finally done, Winston went home. He took a bath and nearly fell asleep in the water, but he was determined to get to Mr. Charrington's shop. He needed to read Goldstein's book even more than he needed to sleep. Once he was in the room, he sat down in the comfortable chair, put some water on the stove to make coffee, and settled down with the book. Julia would be there soon. He would read until she arrived. He opened the book and started to read. The Theory and Practice of Oligarchical Collectivism by Emanuel Goldstein. Chapter 1, Ignorance is Strength. As long as human beings have existed, People have been divided into three social classes: rich, middle class, and poor. No matter what people do, this same pattern always returns. The problem is that all three groups want something different, and that leads to conflict. Winston stopped reading and skipped ahead to another chapter. Chapter 3: War is Peace. The world is divided up into three major powers, just as people predicted. The three powers are Eurasia. This is made up of the areas that used to be called Southern Europe and Russia. Oceania. This is made up of the areas that used to be Great Britain, Australia, and the United States. East Asia. This is made up of the areas that used to be called Northern Europe, China, and Japan. These three powers are always at war with one another. In the beginning, there was a real chance that one of the powers would use nuclear bombs to destroy one of the other powers. However, for the past few decades, the groups have reached a stalemate. All of them have the same amount of power and the same types of weapons. If one power bombs another power, they will just end up destroying one another. You would think that this would mean there would be less violence and war, since there is so little to be gained. Unfortunately, that's not what has happened. The three powers keep on fighting one another constantly, even though each power is able to produce everything its people need without even needing to trade with any of the other powers. They are fighting over an area of land in what used to be called Central Africa and the Middle East. This area has natural resources, such as minerals for mining, that all of them want, even if none of them actually need them. More importantly, this area has a large population. The people there work in factories to make the weapons that the militaries East Asia, Eurasia, and Oceania use to fight their wars. The people in the factories are paid badly. This keeps the weapons they make cheap and means more profit for the people who own the factories. Because the weapons and bombs are cheap, the three powers can afford to continue to fight war after war after war, never stopping. Countries used to fight wars because of disagreements about religion or disputes about who should control an area of land. This is no longer why we have wars. The entire purpose of wars today is to make weapons and use them up, so more weapons need to be made. This keeps the poor people in the factories busy. If they are kept busy, poor, and hungry, they are less likely to revolt. Keeping people busy with work and hungry makes them easier to control. Before World War I, when people imagined what life would be like by the year 1984, they imagined working less, eating more, and having a better quality of life. That isn't what happened. Before World War I, the world was better. There were poor and hungry people then too, but it has gotten worse. The rich have gotten richer, and the poor suffer more than ever. The only reason we have wars is to keep control over most of the population, the proles and the outer party. If we are at war, it makes sense that a small group of people need to be in charge of the country. If there is a crisis, there isn't time to question why. War keeps people afraid and under control without making the government seem like a controlling monster. If there is war, people will work hard all the time so their country can win. In order for the inner party to stay in control, it is important to keep the population desperate and afraid. It is also important to make sure that the population doesn't have the ability to think critically about the events happening around them. Before Big Brother and the party, people learned about science. Science teaches critical thinking, so science is no longer taught in schools. Unless science can be used as a reason to take away freedom, it doesn't serve a purpose. Technology should be making people's lives easier, but it isn't being used that way. Technology is used to take away freedom, not give more freedom. For example, technology could make farming easier, but it isn't used that way. Farmers still use horses and plows, which makes the work difficult. Instead, technology is used to replace artists and writers. Instead of allowing people to think and express their ideas, the party uses technology to write books and create movies. That way, critical thinking is suppressed. The only ideas anyone gets to hear are the party's ideas. Writing and creating art would make the population think. Thinking could lead to questioning the party. This cannot be allowed to happen. Anything that could allow a person to feel unique or fulfilled has been taken away and given to a machine. The party only has two goals. First, they want to know what every person is thinking at all times. Second, they want to know how to kill millions of people instantly and without any warning. These are the only two subjects of any scientific experiment today. Science is no longer used to help humanity learn more about the world around them and how it works. Science is only used to control and hurt others. Scientists no longer try to create medicines to save lives. They only create poisons to kill people. Scientists no longer study the earth to try to give people warnings about disasters like earthquakes or tornadoes. They only want to control these natural disasters so they can use them to hurt their enemies. The last big scientific discovery was the atom bomb back in the 1940s. The United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan during World War II. After seeing the terrible consequences, no country has used an atom bomb since. Instead, the 3 big powers, Oceania, East Asia, and Eurasia, all compete to see which country can make the most bombs. These bombs sit in warehouses as a threat, but it is unlikely that any of them will ever actually be launched at an enemy. None of them want to take any real risks that could lead to defeat. The 3 powers drag the wars out for years and years. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers die in these wars, but nothing is ever gained. What would one power actually do with a territory they conquered and took from another power? The people living in the newly conquered area would all have to be killed, or they would all have to be cut off from any contact with the outside world for decades until they accepted the new leadership. It wouldn't be practical to actually win a war, so the 3 powers make sure nobody ever actually wins. The constant state of war has made all progress in Oceania come to a stop. Technology and education haven't improved in decades. The only government agency that actually gets anything done is the thought police. They continue to develop new technology to spy on citizens. They continue to develop new ways of hurting and torturing their people. Government is supposed to serve and help the people, not make their lives worse. The war has cut off the people of Oceania with any contact with people in other countries. The people of Oceania no longer realize that their government is abusing them, because no one is alive today who remembers anything better. There are no winners in these wars. There are only losers, and the biggest losers are all of the common people, the proles and the outer party members. The war uses up any extra money or resources that could be used to improve the lives of the common people. The money that could be used for better food goes to make guns. The money that could be used for better medical care goes to make bombs. The money that could be used to allow regular people to have more time off from work goes to make bullets. The common people go without most of the basic necessities: good food, clean water, decent housing. Meanwhile, the members of the inner party still have every luxury. Their homes are clean and comfortable. They eat the best food, they smoke good cigarettes, and drink good alcohol. They tell the proles and the members of the outer party that they need to sacrifice for the good of Oceania, but they themselves never sacrifice anything. The outer party of Oceania is not at war against East Asia or Eurasia. It is at war against its own citizens. The wars do not hurt East Asia or Eurasia nearly as much as they hurt their own people. By constantly being at war, the inner party keeps everyone else from standing up for themselves. Without a war to fight against a foreign enemy, the people would undoubtedly begin a civil war to overthrow their corrupt and selfish leaders. As long as the people of Oceania are at war with someone else, they are not at war with their leaders. In this way, war has become a type of peace, at least for the people with the most power and influence. Winston stopped reading. A bomb went off somewhere in the distance. Winston thought the ideas in the book would upset him, so he was surprised that he felt calm. He even felt relieved. The book expressed all the ideas Winston had been carrying around inside his own mind for years, but had been unable to put into words. It was reassuring for him to know that someone else understood exactly what he thought and felt. Winston smiled and thought to himself, "The best books tell you what you already know." "Winston," Julia called. As soon as she came through the door, they ran to one another and kissed. They had not seen one another in a week, and they were so glad to be together again. "I have the book," he told her. "That's good," Julia said, not sounding very interested. She started to make coffee. They lay in bed together, snuggled up under the quilt. The woman at the clothesline was outside again singing. "We both need to read the book," Winston said. "It's important. All the members of the Brotherhood have read it." "Read it out loud to me," Julia said, her eyes still closed. "That way you can explain it to me as we go along." Winston looked at the clock. It was 6 p.m. They had 3 or 4 more hours together before they needed to leave. He picked up the book and began to read. Chapter 1. Ignorance is Strength. As long as human beings have existed, people have been divided into 3 social classes: rich, middle class, and poor. No matter what people do, this same pattern always returns. The problem is that all 3 groups want something different, and that leads to conflict. Winston looked over at Julia. "Are you awake?" he asked. "Yes, my love," she said. "Keep reading." He continued. Every person wants more than what they currently have. The people in the middle class want to be rich. The rich want to get richer. The poor only really want one thing: to create a society where there are no longer social classes and everyone is equal. There is a predictable pattern to how society evolves over time. The rich are usually in power, and they fight to stay in power. The middle class eventually gets tired of the rich controlling everything, overthrows them, and takes power for themselves. Gradually, the middle class gains more and more status and power until they turn into the rich. This cycle repeats over and over again. But what about the poor? They are the one group for whom nothing ever seems to change. The rich fight to stay rich and powerful. The middle class fight to take over and run things their own way. But the poor remain poor and miserable no matter who is in charge. The only thing that changes for the poor are the names of the people giving them their orders. Throughout history, the rich have argued that this is a normal and natural state. It is natural that kings, queens, lawyers, and priests are above everyone else. If it weren't natural, why would it keep happening? Obviously, God wants them to be in charge. It is destiny. Besides, the poor will die someday and get to go to heaven, so this life doesn't matter much anyway. As long as the poor think they'll be rewarded in the future, they will tolerate being miserable and abused today. The middle class has never been content with the rich's explanation of why they deserve to be above everyone else. The middle class has always used words like freedom, liberty, and brotherhood. They pretend their words are meant to include the poor, but they really don't. The middle class are just jealous of the power the rich have. They don't really care about justice for the poor. They only care about making life better for themselves. Nothing ever changed for the poor. This entire system played out exactly this way for thousands of years. Finally, when factories started using machines to make work easier for the poor, things began to change. For the first time in history, there was a real chance that the poor would be able to improve their lives. With machines doing the heaviest, most physical work, social classes would no longer be necessary. The rich and the middle class could not allow that to happen. If some of the wealth and power trickled down to the poor, there would be less wealth and power for them. They were too greedy and selfish to allow that. They created new political theories that called for more separation between the classes. Harsh punishments and undemocratic government practices that had been gotten rid of started to return. People were imprisoned without trial. Political prisoners were tortured. People were executed without ever knowing their crimes. Whole races of people were murdered just so the leaders could maintain power and control. Adolf Hitler was the worst and most famous, but there were others who were just as bad. People who used to call themselves progressives accepted all of it, if it meant they wouldn't lose their status in society. After years of war and chaos, everyone was tired and worn down. That was when Big Brother and the party took control. It was a totalitarian regime that required everyone to bow down to the leader without question. But people were ready for peace, even if it meant giving up some of their freedom. Anything had to be better than the kings, queens, and priests who had gotten everyone into this mess, right? Instead of kings, queens, lawyers, and priests, the new upper class was made up of teachers, journalists, and professional politicians. They built the new government based on their ideals and values. In the new world they created, the rich would no longer control everything, while the middle class and the poor accepted whatever the rich would give them. The new government would ensure that money would be distributed fairly. Everyone would get exactly what they needed, no more, no less. They would create a perfect world. This time, society would get it right. They would use every type of technology that existed to make sure everyone followed the new rules. Cameras and voice recorders were placed everywhere, even in people's homes. They didn't view it as the party controlling them. They viewed it as the party helping them be accountable to doing the right thing. They didn't bother to keep track of the proles, just the people who worked in the party with jobs in the government. It was important to be sure that anyone with any connection to the government truly believed in the party's mission. When someone broke the party's rules, they were punished quickly and violently. It was the only way to ensure loyalty and order. After World War II, it was easy for the party to take over all of the mines, factories, and businesses. People had been hungry and afraid for years by then. The old way of doing things had led to war and fear. This new way of doing things couldn't be any worse. The party promised they would make sure that every person in Oceania got what they needed. There would be no more hunger and no more fear. This was the birth of Oceania's new type of government, which they called Ingsoc. By the time people realized that the new system wasn't truly equal, it was too late. The party was in charge, and no one could stop them. Once a group is in charge, it's hard to get rid of them. There are only 4 ways to destroy a government once it is in power. Number 1, another power that is stronger overthrows it. Number 2, it does such a bad job governing that the people revolt. Number 3, it lets the middle class get too powerful, and eventually the middle class takes over. Number 4, it loses its momentum, gets lazy, and just falls apart, leaving the door open for another power to take over. In Oceania, the only real danger out of the 4 options is number 3. That's why it is so important to make sure the middle class is kept busy with work and is constantly being reminded that the party and its ideas are right. Big Brother is not an actual person or leader. Big Brother is a symbol. There is a reason why no one has ever actually met Big Brother. It's because he isn't real. But the people need to have a face to associate with the government's power. They need a person to support instead of just an idea. Oceania has 3 social classes: the inner party, the highest class; the outer party, the middle class; and the proles, the lowest class. In the past, members of the highest social class were always white. People were born into a social class and stayed there. In Oceania, there are people of all races in the inner party. Oceania is a huge country, so it is important for the party to elect leaders who look like the people in a given area. That way, people don't feel like someone else has come to their homeland to tell them what to do. If their leaders look like them, we were willing to comply with the law. In theory, people are not born into a social class. In reality, that's what ends up happening. The party talks a lot about equality and how people can advance in the party based on their talent and intelligence, but that's not true. Once a person is born into the inner party, the outer party, or the proles, they will remain there. The education and values of each group are different, making it difficult to change classes later in life. Even though the proles are the lowest and largest group, they are unlikely to rebel. They exist in their own society and are mostly happy with their lives. They don't think about how hard their lives are or how they could make their lives better. The proles don't need telescreens watching them day and night. They aren't intelligent enough to rebel anyway. Unless something changes, the proles are not a threat to the party. It's different for members of the party. From the minute they are born, members of the party are watched by the thought police. They grow up, live, and die being watched on a telescreen. Everything they do is watched and analyzed for signs that they do not agree with the party and are a threat to its power. In the past, there were laws, and everyone knew what they were. Oceania does not have laws. This is on purpose. If people don't know what is allowed and what is not allowed, they live in constant paranoia. They question everything they do, and even what they think, fearing that they may do something wrong and get arrested. It isn't enough for a member of the party to do the right thing. They are also supposed to think the right thing. They are taught from the time they are little children that they have to be good thinkers. Members of the party are not supposed to have any private thoughts. From the time they are very young, they learn that even thinking the wrong thing makes them bad. They learn to believe that even the wrong thought is a type of crime. They learn to censor their own thoughts early. This is called Crime Stop. By teaching people that their thoughts are bad and teaching them to stop those thoughts, rebellion is shut down before it ever has a chance to begin. This leads to lots of pent-up anger and frustration that need to be let out somehow. This is the purpose of the 2 minutes hate. It is a way for people to let out all of their rage by directing it at a shared enemy that is not Big Brother or the party. The party makes sure that members avoid critical thinking. Everything is black-white. Things are either right or wrong, and there is no room for anything in between. But it's more than just that. Black-white is also about believing whatever you are told, no matter how stupid or wrong it is. For example, it's about being willing to believe that something black is actually white when your own eyes tell you the truth. It's about denying reality to prove your loyalty to the party. This is called doublethink. A big part of why doublethink works is because of the constant changes the Ministry of Truth makes to the historical records. They change the facts over and over again until no one remembers what really happened. This makes it easier to accept the party's lies. It is easier just to go along with whatever truth is being told at the moment. If Eurasia is Oceania's enemy, they must always have been Oceania's enemy. If you remember that they used to be our ally, you must have remembered it wrong. The party doesn't have to convince you. You willingly convince yourself because it's easier than dealing with the scary reality of the actual truth. The party believes that it will never lose power, just like every other major power has since the beginning of time. Like all of those powerful nations, the party is in denial. They are arrogant. They cannot accept that no power can rule forever. They are sure that they will be the first power to break the pattern of history. The smarter people are, the more delusional they are. The more power people have, the more paranoid they become that someone will take it away from them. Ironically, this delusion and paranoia will be the reasons why they fail. They will be so preoccupied with perceived threats that they won't notice the real threat of the middle class rising up to overthrow them. Everything about the party is made up of doublethink. Even the names of the different parts of the government mean the opposite of what they sound like they mean. The Ministry of Plenty doesn't make sure everyone has enough to eat. They make sure that people are nearly starving so they won't rebel. The Ministry of Love doesn't teach people to be kind and compassionate. They torture and kill anyone who is a threat to the party's power. The Ministry of Truth doesn't keep accurate records of events. It changes them. It changes them constantly so that every record is a lie. The members of the highest social class, the inner party, keep the members of the outer party confused in order to maintain their control over them. I've given you a lot of information about the party and how it functions. I've explained how the party wants to make sure that equality does not occur, but the bigger question is why don't they want equality? There's the obvious reasons, controlling access to resources, feeling special and powerful, But this isn't the main reason. The main reason is... Winston stopped reading. Julia was very quiet next to him. He put his hand on her shoulder. "Julia," he said, "are you awake?" She wasn't. Julia was asleep. The book was boring to her, but it wasn't boring to Winston. He didn't understand all of it. That frustrated him. But he wanted to understand it. That was the difference between Winston and Julia. Winston had a concern for the world and curiosity about it, and Julia did not. Despite feeling confused, Winston was happy. For the first time in many years, he didn't feel crazy. The sun shining on his face through the window, and Julia's warm body was curled up next to his. Life was good, and it would only get better. He fell asleep with a smile on his face.